Okay, good morning, everyone. Um, Today I'll be talking about a topic which is very dear to me. Less pollution is the best solution, and I'm actually going to make a case why sustainability is so critical to the delivery of healthcare. So the agenda of my talk is I'm going to talk about US and the National Health Services of UK. I'll also review the Stanford Healthcare carbon footprint. And using a 6R model of waste reduction, I'm going to talk about some of the latest literature in sustainability over the last couple of years. So the healthcare has been entrusted upon a very noble and enormous responsibility to heal the world. And while it does so, it lands up contributing to around 5% of greenhouse gas emissions. Therefore, if healthcare in itself is a country, it will be the fifth largest emitter on the planet, and therefore providing climate smart health solution is actually the need of the hour. Now, the healthcare contributes to these greenhouse gas emissions through procurement, through use and disposal of products, as well as through running of facilities. Surgery is one of those clinical activities which generates a significant carbon footprint, primarily due to the release of anesthetic gases, as well as due to the release of energy consumption in the ORs. So let's have a look at United States carbon footprint. As I said, the total global greenhouse gas emissions are around 5%. One-fourth of that actually comes from United States. So US spends around 18% of its GDP on healthcare, and it contributes to around 8.5 to 9% of greenhouse gas emissions. In 2018, the toxic air pollutant emissions led to the loss of 388,000 disability-adjusted life years, which were actually of the same magnitude as deaths caused due to preventable medical errors. In terms of per capita emissions, US is an outlier with almost 1,692 kilograms carbon emissions. So these are some of the numbers. The maximum point between healthcare system performance and reduce greenhouse gas emissions and best quality can actually be accomplished at 400 kilogram of carbon dioxide emissions per capita. US is an outlier. We are almost at 1,692 kilograms. This is again a diagram showing US is an outlier as compared to the other countries. So when we talk about greenhouse gas emissions, we also talk about scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. Scope 1 emissions, which actually includes anesthetic gases. For a typical hospital, it contributes to around 7% of their carbon footprint. Scope 2 emissions are actually how that electricity is generated. Is it coming from renewable sources or is it coming from disposable sources like coal? And for a typical hospital, it is roughly around 11% of the carbon footprint. So the bulk of the footprint is actually coming from the scope 3 of the supply chain. And even within the supply chain, if you look at it, pharmaceuticals and single-use devices are responsible for 20% of the carbon footprint. We as healthcare providers make these choices every day. We choose what type of device we use. We choose what type of pharmaceuticals we use and how much to use, how much we land up wasting. So we are actually contributing to some extent to the scope 3 emissions. Now, this study actually also analyzed if there is any association between state level per capita emissions and any association with per capita health expenditure, energy intensity of the electrical grid, healthcare access or quality metrics. So states like in the Midwestern states and Northeastern states actually tend to have much higher per capita emissions state level. And it has nothing to do with the electricity. It has more to do with the expenditure. Those states are expending far more than the southern states as well as the western states. States with high rate of uninsured patients actually tend to spend less on healthcare and eventually land up getting less greenhouse gas emissions. An interesting finding. So if we can decarbonize our electricity, not only we can affect the scope 2 emissions, but we can also play a major role in reducing our scope 3 emissions. Let's have a look at National Health Services of UK. So UK in 2017 did an annual survey estimate of how much emissions are coming from the surgery, and they found that around 42% emissions actually comes from anesthetic gases, 20% specifically from nitrous oxide, and 22% from anesthetic gases. Out of that 22%, 85% of them came from desflurane. Surgical procedures alone led to emissions of around 23%, almost of the same magnitude as anesthetic gases, fluorinated ones. And if you exclude surgical procedures or even anesthetic gases, 58% of the emissions came from electricity or energy consumption and 32% from consumables. So to date, National Health Services is the only healthcare system that actually has mandated government-sponsored reduction in their carbon emission goals. So they started using hybrid accounting methodology and started collecting the data over the last 3 decades. So from 1990 to almost 2019, they actually have generated 26% reduction in their carbon emissions in spite of the fact that their population went up by 17% along with increased infrastructure spending. Now let me compare that with US. US spends 18% of its GDP, 8.5% of greenhouse gas emissions, and our greenhouse gas emissions are actually rising. They're rising by almost 6 to 10% over the last decade. We are rising, they are going down. And the primary way they were able to do that is through decarbonization of their electric grid, as well as phasing out desflurane from their ORs. Let's also have a look of how does anesthetic gases play a global role. So as I said earlier, 5% of emissions came from healthcare. Around 20% of those emissions come from anesthetic gases. And in 2019, a survey was done to evaluate how many surgeries were done globally, and around 200 million anesthetic procedures were done, with a median average of around 4,000 procedures per 100,000 population. In the same year, let's have a look of how much procedures were done in US. 36 million procedures with a median average of 11,000 procedures per 100,000 population. So we are actually doing 2.66 times more surgeries than the rest of the world. Therefore, we are going to have far more impact on our greenhouse gas emissions, and therefore it becomes an unsustainable practice if we don't do anything about it. I'm going to talk briefly about our Stanford healthcare footprint. So the Board of Trustees started this journey in 2009 with the investment in the SESI alternate energy plant. The university is now running on 100% renewable electricity. Over $1 billion has been invested in clean energy systems. Let's have a look at Stanford Healthcare. So in 2021, 375,000 metric tons of emissions came from Stanford Healthcare. Of course, the bulk of them came from Scope 3, almost 80%. And even if you look within Scope 1 and Scope 2, electricity is outsourced to Stanford Health through the city of Palo Alto. And city of Palo Alto is 100% carbon neutral. So basically, we have zero Scope 2 emissions. And if that energy is not coming from the Stanford Health to the city of Palo Alto, our emissions might have been greater by 5%. And let's have a look at Scope 1. And even within the Scope 1, majority of the emissions are coming from transportation, patient transport, as well as the employee. And if you look at medical gases, they are roughly around 7% of our healthcare footprint, exactly what I said earlier. So Stanford made some commitments to become carbon neutral in Scope 1 and 2 in 2025, carbon neutral transportation by 25, zero waste compliance by 25. A draft for sustainable purchasing program has been finalized, and so are the sustainable design guidelines. Stanford Healthcare is the first system or the first healthcare to ever receive green building certification, the highest marker or standards in sustainability. And Stanford Healthcare pledged at a minimum to reduce their emissions by 50% by 2030 and achieve a net zero by 2050, designate an executive level lead by 23, as well as conducting an inventory of Scope 3 by 24. With the idea is to develop and release our climate resilience plan by the end of next year. Just to give you an idea of how much waste is generated, Stanford Healthcare generates 17 tons of waste every 24 hours, which is basically equivalent to 11 residential garbage trucks servicing 11,000 households. I'm happy to report a couple of weeks ago that the Stanford Medicine Board has affirmed their commitment to carbon neutrality. And basically, the board has reinforced that pledge, which has been taken by the leaders of the School of Stanford Healthcare, Medicine, Children Health as well. They joined the Biden administration along with other hospitals to basically achieve a net zero climate warming emissions by 2050. Let's have a look at Stanford Healthcare anesthetic data. So we removed desflurane in 2019. In 2017, the emissions coming from desflurane were roughly around 605 metric tons. Of course, when we removed it in 2019, it was actually an aha moment in a way that, yes, we nailed this problem. Now those emissions are zero. If we look at sevoflurane, our emissions were around 157 metric tons. They came down to 152 metric tons. But the key thing here is in 2017, we have 33 ORs. Now we have 63. We are actually doing twice the number of cases, from almost 25,000 to 45,000. So in spite of doing twice the number of cases, our actually consumption of sevoflurane came down. Now let's also have a look at isoflurane. Isoflurane emissions increased from 88 tons to almost 120 tons. But the next big aha moment will come from nitrous oxide. So the nitrous oxide, if you look at it, in 2019, we purchased around 14.325 metric tons of nitric oxides, generating a carbon footprint of almost 4,000 metric tons CO2 emissions. But in 2021, it actually came down. So when you add all these numbers, your actually emissions have increased by 25%, and the biggest outlier is nitrous oxide. We went up from 3,800 metric tons to almost 4,800 metric tons, again a 25% increase. But statistics is one of the arts where you can play these numbers how you want to. So when we talk about total metric tons emissions of inhaled anesthetics per OR, our numbers actually came down because the denominator increased from 33 to 63. If we look at total metric tons emissions of inhaled anesthetic per OR procedure, we did better, from 0.17 to almost coming down to 0.11. I always was curious to know why our emissions from nitrous oxide are so high. So I did an investigative work. I called the practice Green Health to let me understand, if we have made so much strides in reducing desflurane, why can't we do that for nitrous? And we never even thought about, we presumed that whatever nitrous we are using is actually being delivered to the patient. So recently, Providence Hospital also had the same problem. They started investigating it. And what they found out, the way to do this problem's methodology is, you have to look at the epic chart, how much nitrous is actually delivered to the patient and how much is actually purchased by the hospital. If those numbers match up, great. If those numbers don't match up, the difference is going to be the amount of nitrous oxide which is being wasted into the environment without ever reaching into the patient. And that wastage is happening from the cryogenic nitrous tanks, which are being connected to the big hospital buildings from where the nitrous oxide is being delivered to your pipeline systems. So when they found out that nitrous oxide is they're leaking nitrous oxide at the rate of 2 liters per minute. Those cryogenic tanks actually lose 0.4 to 3% of nitrous oxide per day. And there is generally a combination of 2 tanks. So if you started with the first tank, when the volume of nitrous oxide goes down, the sensors will automatically detect there's a decrease in nitrous oxide. It will turn off the second tank system. But the second tank system may be almost 50 to 70% empty because it's leaking continuously. So they replaced that problem by replacing those cryogenic tanks with the regular cylinders. Even then, the waste reduction came down from 2 liters per minute to almost 0.6 liters per minute, still reduction by 65%. But still, they were not able to figure out why this leakage is happening. We are not really consuming that much of nitrous oxide. So they found out that the pipeline system has so many leaks which are very hard to fix. Number one, quite expensive. So they came up with a novel idea that we can just replace nitrous oxide with small, portable e-cylinders, which we already have in our operating rooms, and we use it. We open it up at the start of the day. We shut it off at the end of the day. And by doing so, they were able to reduce their carbon footprint from nitrous oxide by 99% because they fixed the leak. I do not believe that we are using 17.898 metric pounds or metric tons of nitrous oxide. We are purchasing that much. I don't think so we are really delivering it. So my next big project is to address nitrous oxide emissions. Even if we can accomplish some of those results, I think we can make a significant strides in cutting back on our greenhouse gas emissions. So these are some of the numbers. Our emissions from anesthetics per OR came down. On the other hand, our greenhouse gas emissions, primarily because of nitrous oxide, went up from 4,000 metric tons to 5,000, almost by 25%. The second project which I started in 2020 was a blue wrap recycling project. So in 2020, we basically collected around 900 pounds of blue wrap. And as you can see now, 21 and 22, the numbers have gone up. We are actually collecting it from the whole Stanford Healthcare entity. Earlier, we were collecting only from ASC. So far we have collected 6,000 pounds of blue wrap that has led to greenhouse gas reduction of 4.3 metric tons, almost equivalent to avoiding 11,000 miles. Now, this blue wrap actually goes to a company called Iron Mountain or Blue Renew, and they are basically making recyclable plastic products which can easily be utilized within the hospital, thus some sort of creating a circular economy. So I'm going to switch gears here and I'll talk about some of the literature. So the first R I'm going to talk about is R, remove. We have already removed desflurane from our ORs. So this is a study done to see the impact of surgery on the global climate, a sort of a carbon footprinting of 3 different hospitals in 3 different countries. So John Radcliffe Hospital is in UK, University of Minnesota Medical Center in US, and Vancouver Hospital in Canada. All of them are tertiary hospitals. They have 21 to 24 operating rooms. John Radcliffe Hospital does around 30,000 cases. On the other hand, University of Minnesota does around 18,000 cases. But if you look at letter C, which is represented by John Radcliffe Hospital, only 4% of their emissions came from anesthetic gases because they removed desflurane from their ORs. However, 84% came from inefficient energy systems. They are not using renewable electricity, and maybe their energy systems are not retrofitted to the latest standards. So 84% of their carbon footprint actually came from there. On the other hand, if you look at B, which is University of Minnesota Medical Center, 51% of our emissions came from desflurane, and 36% came from, again, energy, because they are still not using 100% renewable electricity. So if you divide that by the number of cases, University of Minnesota Medical Center actually has the highest carbon footprint among all these 3 hospitals. Now, everything has a cost. So the global social cost of volatile anesthetic agents is actually determined by calculating the expected economic damages that is happening from carbon dioxide emissions. And they have given that number is $417 per ton of metric emissions of CO2. So if you apply the same analogy, desflurane, if used for 1 MAC for 1 hour at 2 liters fresh gas flow, will generate a social cost of $78, which could be 26 to 39 times higher than using CO or isoflurane, depending upon the fresh gas flows. In terms of auto emissions, using sevoflurane at 2 liters will generate the same emissions as somebody who drove 8 miles. Isoflurane at 1 liter, 7 and 189 miles for desflurane. So let me take a step back here. We have removed desflurane. Our electricity is 100% carbon neutral. These are the 2 best things that you can ever expect from a healthcare system. If we can nail down the nitrous oxide problem, we will have the cleanest department from anesthetic emissions, because we will take care of all the 3 problems which are basically creating carbon emissions from the surgery. The second R I'm going to talk about is reduce. So besides choosing which anesthetic gas to use, all of us control at what fresh gas flows we are going to use it. And this study actually analyzed the kinetics and the consumption patterns of different approaches to sevoflurane delivery to maintain 2% end tidal concentration. They basically compared 4 different strategies: 2 liters fresh gas flow, minimally or manually adjusted minimal fresh gas flow, which is roughly 300 cc's per minute. And they were comparing 2 different softwares, AGC 4.04 and AGC 4.07. AGC 4.07 is actually a latest software, and the big difference between these software is the latest software comes in 4 speed modes. Higher the speed, the less of the time it will take to reach that 2% end tidal concentration or 1 MAC. And what they looked at is the consumption pattern of how much sevoflurane is being used, because it has direct environmental and financial benefits. So at 2 liters fresh gas flow, which is the commonest one, after 45 minutes, we consumed 14.5 cc's of sevoflurane. Comparing that with manually adjusted gas flows, we only consumed 5 cc's. Now, how many of us are comfortable using 300 cc's per minute fresh gas flow? I think probably less than 1%, if I have to make a guess. So if you compare AGC 4.07 at speed 2, it only led to consumption of 6 cc's of sevoflurane. So in other words, 2 liters fresh gas flow actually led to 240% increase in our consumption of sevoflurane. Simply replacing our machines with this software, using it for 250 days a year, 8 hours a day, will lead to an annual savings of 17 liters of sevoflurane per year from each machine, which means we can reduce 9 metric tons of carbon dioxide emissions per machine. Now, the annual savings we will generate from this software upgrade will almost like 6,000 euros in terms of the sevoflurane reduction of consumption. The software in itself costs 5,000 euros, so the return of investment can be easily accomplished within 1 year. While we don't have a software like that, we really worked very hard to get a fresh gas flow alerts installed into our system. This is pretty much in the final stages, and hopefully we'll do a test run in the next coming months or so. Let's have a talk about the pharmaceutical waste. So, as I said, pharmaceutical is responsible for around 10 to 15% of the greenhouse gas emissions. Manufacturing of an active pharmaceutical compound is an extremely energy intensive, material intensive process in the chemical sense because of the number of synthesis steps that you really require to produce a compound. And this study highlights the greenhouse gas emissions coming from the 20 most common anesthetic agents. The lowest one is succinylcholine, 11 kilograms carbon dioxide emissions per kilogram of succinylcholine, to almost 3 metric tons of carbon dioxide emissions coming from Presidex. I'll be honest with you, after reading this article, I have a very high regard for Presidex. I'm not using it as often as I used to in the past. Most of the anesthetic gases, greenhouse gas emissions, are less than 200 kilograms, almost 80% of the drugs. Unfortunately, there's a very poor correlation between molecular weight, complexity of the compound, or the number of synthesis steps with greenhouse gas emissions. Now, we all know that there's a significant amount of wastage that is happening in the operating rooms. Preparing these drugs is a time-consuming process, and it is a potential source of attention diversion from patient care. Because of the nature of the job we are in and the risk of error running so high, we land up preparing these drugs much in advance. And a lot of times when these drugs are not used, they land up getting wasted. A typical anesthesia department pharmacy budget is roughly around 10 to 15% of the total hospital pharmacy budget. So not only we create environmental pollution, it also costs to the hospital because these drugs are getting wasted. So this study was done in Italy in 12 operating rooms, 12 institutions, including 2 academic centers, where they wanted to understand how much wastage is happening in their operating room setup. 2 of these hospitals are teaching hospitals. So before running the study, they actually did a pilot feasibility study for a month, and then, of course, extrapolated the data over a next year or so. They wanted to know how much time does it take to prepare these drugs. Now, in this study, the drugs were prepared by the nursing staff, not by the anesthesiologist. They also looked at which are the most common wasted drugs. So the most common wasted drugs are 8% rocuronium, 16% was propofol. I would argue if we do the study in our setup, that will never be true. And 86% was epinephrine, 71% for atropine, with a median waste of around 38%. The amount of time spent on preparing these syringes on an average was 39 seconds. So in their pilot feasibility study, they collected the data on 13,000 syringes, and when they extrapolated it, they found around 139,000 syringes were actually wasted, costing them 78,000 euros or $92,000. I think in our setup, these numbers will be even higher. Now, if I look at it, propofol and rocuronium are only responsible for 8% or 16% of the waste. But if you look at in terms of the financial cost, they contributed to around 20% of the financial impact, meaning these drugs are far more expensive than the rest of the drug. So, as I said, the amount of time they spent in preparing these drugs was 39 seconds. When they cumulatively applied, it led to the loss of 1,512 working hours of the healthcare providers to prepare these drugs. And by the way, these drugs generated 5 metric tons of waste alone, which also has an additional disposal cost of $12,000. This graph actually shows the impact of each component of the drug. So, for example, a drug like rocuronium, 86% of the drug is actually the cost of the drug, versus atropine, where 30% of the drug is actually the drug itself, and rest of the things are, the saline label, syringe, and disposals. One of the things I think COVID taught us is our resources are finite. They are not forever. And this is a graph showing the consumption pattern of different drugs prior to pandemic and after during the pandemic. So the consumption of propofol and cisatracurium actually went up almost by 100%, and we saw those supply chain issues. Presidex consumption went up by 211%, cisatracurium by 165%. Now, I recently completed a cell project about propofol waste. I said, what can we do about it? So propofol is the most common anesthetic we use. It's also the most wasted drug. Up to 60% of the propofol is wasted in our setup, almost 900 gallons. We procure around 1,500 gallons, and it's costing the institution almost $500,000. It is toxic to aquatic animals, and it, of course, generates greenhouse gas emissions. So we created a SMART goal. So first, we did a baseline audit. We actually did some survey about how much waste is happening, and we calculated the waste per case. So, and then we envisioned that by the end of our project, we want to cut down this waste by 50%. We sent a survey. Why this waste is happening in the first place? As expected, work pressure was the number one reason for these wasteful practices. Absence of a standardized tool to determine how much propofol we actually need to use, along with easy access to large-sized bottles. There was also an inconsistent utilization of the syringe pump. We just came up with 3 interventions. Number one, remove access to large-sized bottles. Create a calculator and tell, so that way we can tell how much propofol you actually need to use, and encourage everyone to use a syringe pump. So post-intervention, our data showed 34% to 61% reduction in 3 out of 4 locations. And that has an impact to generate potential savings of $300,000 and almost reducing the global greenhouse gas emissions almost by 2/3. And by the way, this is just one drug. If we start looking at neosynephrine, we start looking at nitroglycerin, those numbers can even be different. So there is a way we can address pharmaceutical waste. I'm going to go to the next R, which is replace. Now, we know that total intravenous anesthetic is the most environmental friendly option when we are comparing it with inhalation anesthetic gases. But what about with the use of vapor capture technology? So this study was done to compare 1 Mach hour of inhalational anesthetic gases, carbon emissions, with 1 Mach hour equivalent with propofol, utilizing propofol at 60 cc's per hour. So author ran 3 different scenarios, and before they do that, they said, okay, in vapor capture technology, the 2 presumptions we are going to make is we will only recycle the anesthetic once with a recycling ratio of 70%. Anesthetic gases are prepared by 2 different methodologies, method A and method B. Generally, method B is considered more advanced, generating less carbon emissions. And they also wanted to look at the fresh gas flow requirements of 2 different countries. For example, in UK, you can use sevoflurane at any fresh gas flows, even 2.5 liters fresh gas flows. But in US, you still use sevoflurane at 2 liters fresh gas flow. So in the scenario 1, they basically looked at using nitrous as a carrier gas and comparing all the different anesthetics. Scenario 2 and 3 is using oxygen air as a carrier gas and comparing all those numbers. So the diagram on the left is actually without the use of vapor capture technology. So we already know when desflurane was used as when nitrous oxide is used as a carrier gas in scenario 1, and we use desflurane, sevoriso, the impact of desflurane is the highest. No surprises. Even when we use oxygen air and desflurane, still desflurane is the highest. And of course, propofol impact was the lowest, as already known. And propofol generates around 1 kilogram carbon dioxide emissions per Mach hour. And out of that, half of it comes from the electricity we use to prepare those syringes. Now let's look at the graph on the right side when they use a vapor capture technology. So utilizing vapor capture technology in scenario 1, using nitrous oxide as a carrier gas, actually it led to the highest reduction in desflurane greenhouse gas emissions And it even brought it down below sevoflurane prepared from method A. But when you look at scenario 2 and 3, the impact of greenhouse gas emission reduction was highest for SIVO and ISO. If we pay attention to scenario 3, utilizing fresh gas flows at half a liter per minute, utilizing vapor capture technology, utilizing method B to prepare sevoflurane, the impact of sevoflurane will be almost identical to propofol, generating 1 kilogram carbon dioxide emissions per Mach hour. We don't have a vapor capture technology yet available in our setup, number one. Number two, if we convert that electricity from disposable to renewable sources for preparing syringes of propofol, it will cut the emissions of propofol even further by half, making still total intravenous anesthetic the most environmental friendly choice. Now let's look about, should TIVA be used as an argument if there's a pregnant woman in the operating room? So there was a meta-analysis done by the authors, and they found that there is a higher prevalence of fetal loss among pediatric anesthesiologists than non-peds anesthesiologists. Scavenging systems can actually eliminate between 40 to 94% of these waste anesthetic gases. In a resource-limited country like India, having an investment is a huge ask if you want to have a scavenging system in every operating room. So the author is proposing maybe the new indication of using TIVA would be if there is a pregnant provider or a pregnant patient in the room, we should be considering using total intravenous anesthetic, especially when we don't have efficient scavenging systems. Now, I always believed that regional anesthesia is the most environmental friendly choice. This article actually changed my perspective a little bit. This study was done to evaluate the carbon footprinting of general, regional, and knee replacement and combined anesthetics for total knee replacement. The study is done in Australia, where the source of electricity is coal, not renewable. So the mean emissions coming from general anesthesia was around 14.9 kilograms emissions per case. Spinal was actually higher, 16.9, and the combined was even higher at 18.5. If you quantify it further, 20% of the emissions came from electricity. 25% of the emissions came from the use of single-use devices. Within spinal anesthesia, using fresh gas flows of more than 6 to 10 liters per minute led to 16% of greenhouse gas emissions, meaning oxygen is also not free in terms of a carbon footprint. Now, sevoflurane led to 35% of carbon emissions under general anesthesia and around 19% of carbon emissions in a combined approach. Even there is a regional difference. For example, if you do a spinal in EU, your carbon footprint is almost 60% less than doing a spinal in Australia. And the reason being because everything in EU is prepared from renewable sources. So your scope 2 as well as scope 3 emissions are significantly reduced. Now I'm going to go to the next R, which is reuse. You know, the worth of disposable medical devices is roughly around, industry is around $50 billion, and it's rising at a rate of around 4% per year. Blood pressure devices are routinely used as reusable devices because they are considered as low risk of infection. Reusable devices generate carbon footprint because of the labor cost to clean them, as well as because of the number of wipes you use. Now, if you use one reusable device on multiple patients versus using only one reusable device on one patient, that will have implications because how many times you will have to clean it. Disposable devices are, of course, generating carbon footprint from production, transportation, and eventually incineration. So the author looked at 4 different scenarios. Scenario number A, which is in the office setting, comparing 20 patients in which they're using disposable blood pressure cuffs versus one reusable cuffs. Of course, no surprises there. Using a reusable cuffs generated far lesser greenhouse gas emissions by almost a factor of 40. Now, looking at the scenario number B, in ambulatory procedure settings, they compared emissions coming from disposable versus reusables on 10 patients. Now, 10 patients will get disposable cuffs, and now they're comparing it either with one reusable cuff or 3 reusable cuffs, one in pre-op, one in intra-op, and one in PACU. So when you use 3 reusable cuffs, your greenhouse gas emissions from reusables are still better, but the factor drops from 40 to almost 13. The third scenario is utilizing it in the inpatient setting. over a length of stay for 5 days. So now the emissions are, of course, divided over a course of 5 days. If you're using a reusable cup for 5 days, if you're cleaning it after each measuring reading, using more and more wipes, that will actually make reusable blood pressure cups less favorable, and that the factor difference actually came down to 2 to 3. Same thing happened in the ICU setting, in the D setting, where they basically compared one reusable cups versus 20 disposable cups for length of stay in the ICU for 5 days, and they found that the reusable cups actually are better if they are only cleaned once after the end of 5 days on the patients. So in terms of costing, utilizing a disposable cup in an office clinic setting is not a financially good idea. It will be costing 10 times higher than the reusable cups. Even within the ambulatory surgery procedure center, the savings could be either 10 times or 3 times, depending upon whether you're using one reusable cup versus 3. In the regular ward setting, they actually never break even. Actually, disposable cup was a cheaper option than using a regular ward because of the number of wipes it required. Now I'm going to talk to the next R, which is the recycling. Recycling honestly is a myth. But we'll talk about it. So this study was conducted by Cassandra Thiel in 2014. She actually did a study to evaluate greenhouse gas emissions coming from hysterectomy, utilizing 4 different approaches. And this study actually took one step further: which strategies will work the best in cutting down those emissions. So they looked at different scenarios. Under anesthesia interventions, comparing desflurane with nitrous oxide, sevoflurane with nitrous oxide, or a total intravenous anesthetics. Under material interventions, they looked at maximizing recycling, maximizing regulated medical waste reduction, maximizing the use of OR towels and surgical gowns. Under energy interventions, they looked at adding an occupancy sensor into the operating room, converting electricity to renewable sources. Anesthetic gases, if we do a better job in cutting back our fresh gas flows, replacing gases with the lowest global warming potential, or converting to TIVA, has the highest impact. 25% reduction in laparoscopic surgeries can happen just by changing the anesthetic choice. Now, if you do single-use devices reprocessing, that can lead to additional 10% reduction in your greenhouse gas emissions. Maximizing recycling, regulated medical waste reduction, only led to 5% reduction in their greenhouse gas emissions, because recycling is not the be-all, end-all solution for waste reduction. Actually, under the hierarchy of waste to reduce waste, recycling is very low in that list. The first number is always remove, not to recycle, because recycling requires a market. If I'm going to put something in the trash bin, is there a market for someone to take it and use it for other purposes? Now, the maximum benefit happened from utilizing reusable surgical instruments or using minimal materials. That has an impact of decreasing your greenhouse gas emissions by almost 50%. The last segment of my talk is about research. Implementing carbon tax is an effective strategy in addressing carbon pollution. So the study is done in Canada. The author actually, just like us, did an educational project in 2016 to remove desflurane from their ORs. And by 2019, they were able to remove desflurane from their ORs. Currently in Canada, there is a tax of 30 Canadian dollars per metric tons of carbon dioxide. If we apply the same tax on our anesthetic gases, it will increase the price of CO by $1.48 per bottle, increase the price of desflurane by $26. They are projecting this tax will go up in 2030 to $170, which will increase the price of CO by $8 and desflurane by $151, making it financially unsustainable to use desflurane. Currently, volatile anesthetic gases are not included in the greenhouse gas inventory or formulary to impose these taxes. But again, for healthcare institutions, it can be a strategy to force them not to use a gas with the highest global warming potential. I have heard from many of my colleagues there is a unique advantage of using desflurane in obese patients. So this is a meta-analysis of randomized control trials, which actually did show that if you use desflurane, patients are able to open up their eyes faster by almost 4 minutes, and they were extubated also by 5 minutes sooner than a sevoflurane. However, there is no difference in the incidence of post-op cognitive decline or the discharge of these patients from the PACU. Even under the ERAS guidelines for bariatric surgery, under the standard anesthetic protocol, it does not allow recommendation of specific anesthetic agent or technique. The only thing that got the highest recommendation was using an opioid-sparing anesthetics. Let's also have a talk about sevoflurane and compound A. So this is again a meta-analysis of randomized controlled trials, and based on the outcome of this meta-analysis, they found that sevoflurane does not contribute more to nephrotoxicity in humans than other anesthetics. And the reason is we are not comparing apples to apples. The studies were done on mice. Mice has increased activity of enzyme beta lyase in their tubular cells. That is what leads to generation of compound A. Humans don't have that enzymes. Millions and millions of anesthetics has been given. Not even a single case report of compound A has come from anesthetics. So based on this, they found that there is no association between the use of sevo and post-op renal impairment as compared to other anesthetic agents. And therefore, the scientific basis for recommending higher fresh gas flows needs to be revisited. These are the ASA statement, and basically they do acknowledge that FDA still recommends using 2 liters fresh gas flow, which leads to excessive consumption and waste of sevo. So ASA has evaluated the scientific evidence and concludes it is safe to administer sevoflurane with fresh gas flows of less than 2 liters, despite the FDA warning, as long as we are using a weak base CO2 absorbent. So friends, I'm going to wrap up my talk here. So far we discussed about 2 different healthcare systems: US, where the emissions are going up; National Health Services, where the emissions have actually come down by 26%. We are also looking at recycling is not the solution because it has a very low hierarchy in waste reduction. Pharmaceutical waste is extensive, and it is primarily determined by manufactured packaging sizes. We have no control over that. Manufacturers are incentivized to prepare drugs in multi-dose vials, larger vials, and also there is a lack of awareness among healthcare providers about how our actions impact sustainability. The concept of best patient outcome practices has to include optimizing resources and pollution prevention. And many countries are actually addressing it. For example, in Sweden, they have something called WISE list. Every medication label will demonstrate the PBT scoring, which is its impact on the environment, so physicians can do environmental preferable prescribing. We really need an honest discussion between our ID practices and also pollution prevention, because we need some sort of a risk stratification. These practices are becoming unsustainable. We know that the number of surgeries are increasing, so is the waste. Robotic surgeries actually generate 30% more waste than the regular surgeries. So teaching hospitals generate more waste than non-teaching hospital because of the teaching nature of the hospitals. So what we have learned from these is we can utilize the 6R model of waste reduction, remove what we can, reduce what we should, and reuse what we must, because we clearly have not made our healthcare sustainable. So clearly, creating less pollution is the only and the best solution. I'm going to rest my case. Thank you for listening.
Let me grab you. We are not supposed to our what is a strategy we can use as an institution to help with that?
So recently, Jody Sherman was invited to the US Congress, and basically about climate crisis and what healthcare is doing to address it. This is exactly one of the topics that came up for discussion, that we are wasting so many drugs because of these outdated rules and regulations which we have to deal with it. I mean, to be honest, I use propofol. I take a 50 cc vial. I use 20 cc's in every different syringes, so I can apply it in using on two different or three different patients. As long as I'm not using the same syringe, I mean, the argument is, the choice is pharmaceutical waste is hard to handle under the current context. You really have to be innovative, and the innovation has to come from within. Industry is lagging behind in many ways in providing us the solutions to some of our problems. I don't have any control of many drugs, but specifically for propofol, if I take away a 50 cc bottle, 100 cc bottle, then my choices are 20 and 50 cc's, and I have to use that methodology. Do I need 20 cc's or do I need 50 cc's? So that way I can cut back on the waste. And the calculator will play a huge role in knowing how much you really need. Now, if you need 25 cc's, let's say hypothetically speaking, then you are still better off using 220 cc vials than 150 cc vials. But I think you really have to be proactive in thinking about it. How much do I need? And many times I ask surgeons, how much time? I'm not asking them to do their job faster, but I really need to know, do I need to open up a 20 cc bottle versus a 50 cc's? And sometimes you have to be proactive in cutting back your waste. Right? Right. So in an OR, 25% of the waste is happening from the anesthesia side. 75% is still the surgical waste. I think there are few surgeons who are looking into that, number one. It will require recreating your surgical kits, number one. Many of these things are coming in pre-packages formulation, or, this is how it is being made. And I think as Stanford as an entity has a huge role in negotiating with these companies, of course, based on the feedback from the surgeons, these are the things we really don't need. So if you can remove those things, first of all, it will bring down the cost. Second of all, it will bring down the waste. And this is a good thing for the hospital. So I think as an entity like Stanford Healthcare, we have a far higher, better negotiating power than just as an individual to make these changes.
You talked about using syringe pumps versus the drip pumps.
Right.
Is that what you were comparing, propofol?
Yes.
And that doesn't matter whether you're taking into consideration the human element in time taken to, and is that only in the OR or in the ICU as well?
I think in the ICUs, the challenge is different for two reasons. Number one, in the ICU settings, many of these patients are going to be on mechanical ventilation for a long time. There's a cost to everything. Are you going to make this change to increase the labor cost? And of course, in ICUs, nursing staff maybe 1:2 or 1:1, depending on the acuity of the patients. So I am mindful of the fact I don't want to increase too much of the work on them at the same time. So many times in ICUs, they are still using 100 cc bottles. We have made a proactive effort in reducing it in the ORs, because generally the duration of case is less, shorter cases, and the dead space of a syringe pump tubing is 3 cc's versus 30 cc's. So the first bottle you inject is more than 60% of that is wasted anyways if you're using an Alvis pump.
Accomplished. It may be helpful to explain to people about the ICDP programs, what you've done with that, and ideas if people have them, how they develop it.
Sure. So the first ICD or CSRP project I took was converting, that was on Desflurane, of course, but Desflurane did not land up getting an ICD project, even though it was a great project. We didn't, sorry, I should take it back. It was not, I'm confusing with the CSRP, but ICDP project, the first one was a Desflurane, because
I don't think people know what they are.
Right.
So you just first explain to people.
Okay, so these projects are basically an effort to reduce, if you're making a change in the system by improving the quality and reducing and generating savings, a significant part of the savings can easily be given back to the department. So I conducted some of these projects. One was the Despurain. We did a biohazardous waste reduction project, and through education by installing a poster, creating a custom size, bins, what goes where. Over the course of a year, there was a significant financial savings for the institution, and a part of it landed up going to the hospital. So in other words, I think these are great projects. If you have any idea where you think it will not only improve the quality, but also has a potential to generate financial savings, please let me know. I mean, definitely we can work on it together and make a case so that the department as well as the institution both benefit from it.
That was a very sobering thought. Praveen, thank you so much for doing this for us.
Thank you.
Yes, that was a very good talk.